Hello, listener. The fact you hear this means you're alive. If you're new here, consider subscribing and comment below where you're listening from. Let's begin the story. My name is Dexter Vann, and I was always the kind of guy who fixed problems before they had a chance to spread. I worked regular hours, paid off my tools, and saved every spare dime for the one thing that actually made sense to me. A little square houseboat tied to a quiet lake just outside the city limits. It isn't a yacht, and it isn't cute in that glossy magazine way. It is basically a floating box with windows, a roof, a tiny galley kitchen, and a wood stove. I installed myself because I hate being cold a hell of a lot more than I hate hauling firewood. The hull is simple, the engine is basic, and the whole place was built for slow weekends and calm water, not for running for your life. A few miles up the shoreline sits my cabin, which is honestly more of a shed than a lodge. With a small porch, a stack of split logs, and a view that used to feel like hitting a reset button on the week. Calla, my wife, liked it for the same reason I did, mostly because it was a place where the cell signal dropped dead and the world stopped asking us questions. Late fall had already stripped the trees bare and pushed the tourists back home. The nights were stretching out, the wind coming off the water had turned sharp, and the docks were starting to get that empty off-season look. That is exactly when everything changed. People like to say you can feel the end coming, but I didn't feel a thing. The first signs were just ordinary frustrations, traffic that gridlocked and didn't move, sirens that wouldn't quit, and news alerts that sounded serious without actually saying anything clear. By the time the anchors finally used the word outbreak, the city was already chewing on itself. The lake was supposed to be the simple escape. A boat means distance, distance means safety, and water is a hard line for anything that can't think. That was my logic anyway. It was also the first thing the lake proved wrong. The neighborhood didn't get loud right away, it just felt wrong. The rhythm was off. There were no kids on bikes, no dog walkers, no landscaping crews blowing leaves, just the wind pushing debris into little piles and the sound of sirens drifting in from the main road, all of them wailing at once. Calla stood at the granite counter with a coffee mug in her hands, and the warm yellow light over the kitchen sink made everything look perfectly ordinary, right up until her phone buzzed against the surface, then buzzed again, and kept buzzing. She glanced down at the screen, then looked up at me with tight eyes and said, "You're getting these alerts too, right?" The text was one of those vague emergency broadcasts, the kind that tells you to remain calm while carefully avoiding any details about what is actually happening. We flipped on the TV, but the news just filled the gaps with anchors talking too fast and refusing to commit to facts. On one shaky vertical clip filmed outside a hospital, someone in the background slammed their body into a locked glass door over and over until they slid out of the frame. 2 blocks over, a scream snapped through the cool air, short and sharp, and a car horn got stuck and just stayed stuck, a long, flat note of panic. Calla set her mug down untouched, the coffee still steaming, and said, "We should go, Dexter. Right now." She didn't need to name the destination. The lake was 40 minutes away, the houseboat was ours, and water is the only distance you can count on when the streets turn into a mob. The porch camera chimed on the wall tablet, showing a woman sprinting past our driveway with one shoe missing and her coat hanging off one shoulder. A man came after her, but he wasn't sprinting like a person chasing someone down. He was stumbling and lunging, arms flailing out, head leading the body. The woman cut around a parked SUV and vanished, and the man walked straight into the passenger door hard enough to leave a dent, bounced off, then turned and kept moving like he hadn't felt a thing. Calla watched the screen, her face pale, and said, "That is not somebody high. That's something else." Her voice stayed steady, which actually made it worse because it meant she had already accepted that the rules had changed. So we moved. There was no debate, no sitting down to plan, just the mental checklist that comes up when winter is closing in, only faster. Warm clothes, 0-degree sleeping bags, food that keeps, water, first aid, tools, and whatever makes a small boat livable for the long haul. I yanked the camping bin down from the garage shelf first. Sleeping bags, LED headlamps, the compact nesting pot set, and the little hiking filter that we both knew still needed boiling to be 100% safe. Calla was already sweeping shelves into bags, adding batteries, duct tape, heavy-duty trash bags, and baby wipes, and she said, "If we get stuck somewhere without running water, this is the only thing that keeps us from getting sick." The pantry got stripped in fast, desperate armfuls. Rice, dried beans, peanut butter, canned soup, and the last box of protein bars. The fridge gave up blocks of cheese and sealed lunch meat, and the freezer gave up a bag of ice for the cooler. We filled every water jug we had and tossed them into a tote with a lid. A small biometric lockbox in my office held the gun I never wanted to need. It was a plain 12-gauge hunting shotgun, heavy, wood-stocked, and loud, and I checked the chamber with the same grim hope you check a fire extinguisher. Calla watched me snap the case shut and said, "If we bring that, we don't stop for people on the road, that's the deal." I looked at her and nodded because that was the only answer that made sense. Bear spray came next, clipped to the outside of her tactical bag. The handheld marine radio went into mine, along with the boat registration and the spare dock keys. Cash, phone chargers, and a hand-crank lantern followed. The pile landed by the front door and Calla shouted from the hallway, "Shoes and coats, heavy ones!" A sedan rolled past our house with its back window smashed out, and a man leaned out the driver's side and yelled, "They're biting people! Get the hell out!" He didn't slow down, and he didn't look back to see if we listened. The garage door groaned as it lifted, the sound seeming too loud in the sudden quiet. I paused with it halfway up, listened, then finished the lift when nothing moved near our driveway. Packing the car took 3 minutes of controlled chaos. The heavy cooler went behind the seats, bags were jammed on top, and the shotgun case got wedged deep at the bottom, buried under 50 pounds of gear where it was safe but hard to reach. Calla slid into the passenger seat with her phone in her lap. At the end of the block, a man stood in the middle of the road with his hands out, trying to flag cars down. Blood streaked his white dress shirt, and he kept pointing frantically behind him. Calla looked at me, jaw set, and said, "Keep going. Don't slow down." The words weren't cruel. They were the only way to keep the car from becoming a steel trap. We eased around him, tires hopping the curb, and as we passed, he stepped toward us, eyes wide and bloodshot, mouth working like he was trying to form a sentence that wouldn't come. Another scream rose from a backyard fence, then cut off fast, and the man snapped his head toward it and started shambling that way instead. The main road was total gridlock. Cars were angled across lanes, doors stood open, and people were standing on the asphalt arguing like arguing could fix the end of the world. Calla leaned forward, scanned the gravel shoulder, and said, "We take the berm and we don't hesitate." Gravel popped under the tires as I dropped 2 wheels off the pavement, but the shoulder moved, and every few seconds someone tried to swing into our line like they'd just had the same idea. Near a bus stop, a man in a nice wool coat dropped to his knees beside someone lying on the sidewalk. For half a second, it looked like he was helping. Then his head dipped, his shoulders jerked violently, and the person under him stopped struggling. Calla turned her face toward the side window and said, "Don't look at it," and her voice shook on the last word. The first clear stretch of road felt unreal. The trees closed in. The noise of the city faded, and for a moment it was just the hum of the engine and the sound of our own breathing. Calla kept her hand on the dash, knuckles white, and said, "Once we're at the lake, we stay off the shore as much as we can. We live on the water." I answered, "We get to the dock, we get on, and we push out." And saying it out loud made it feel like an actual plan instead of a panic response. A few miles later, a station wagon sat sideways across our lane, hazards flashing, driver door hanging open. We crept around it with the wheels deep in the dirt, and something stood up in the brush near the open door, slow and unsteady, turning its head toward the sound of our engine. No shout came, no plea for help, just a lurch forward that looked mechanically wrong in a human body. Calla whispered, "Go," and the car surged forward, leaving the figure to stumble and fall back into the weeds. That was the moment the lake stopped being a weekend place in my head and turned into a lifeboat, because the road behind us was already eating people. The farther we drove from town, the more the world tried to trick us into thinking it was normal. We passed bare trees, empty harvested fields, and a gray sky that didn't care about anyone's problems, but the radio kept cutting in with jagged warnings that didn't match the calm scenery. Calla held her phone with both hands like a lifeline, checking for a signal that wasn't there, then finally set it down and just watched the road. After a while, she looked over and said, "Do you want the quiet?" I said, "Yeah, cut it," and she reached out and killed the volume. The highway gave us one last reminder before it released us. A pickup truck sat half on the gravel shoulder with its hood up, and a man was waving both arms overhead like he was flagging down roadside assistance. A person was lying on the asphalt at his feet, not injured, but scrabbling at his ankles, twisting and grabbing at his pant leg with both hands. Calla said, "Don't stop, Dexter," and the tires crunched onto the gravel as we slipped around the scene. In the rearview mirror, I saw the man fall backward and he didn't get back up. After that, nobody talked much. The lake road turned off the highway and narrowed into deep pines, the pavement turning rough and patched, and the light went flat. That specific late fall dusk that arrives too early and makes everything feel like it is closing in on you. The cabin access road was nothing but gravel and rain ruts. I eased the car in and killed the headlights before the last bend, letting the vehicle creep forward on momentum alone, because sound carries for miles in these woods when the wind is low. The cabin sat where it always did, set back from the water, small and dark, and for one clean second my chest loosened. Then I saw the dock. A shape was there, low and square against the lake, the houseboat's blunt outline, but it wasn't sitting in its usual spot. The bow was angled wrong, drifting too far out, and the mooring line ran to the cleat like someone had tied it in a panic. One window blind was caught halfway up, crooked like someone had looked out and forgotten to fix it. Calla leaned forward against the dash and said, "It's here." Relief tried to rise in my throat, but it didn't stick because the scene felt disturbed. We parked behind the cabin where the dense trees hid the car from the road, shut the doors gently until they clicked, and stood still to listen. No motors, no voices, just water tapping the dock posts and the soft, dry rattle of dead leaves. The cold slid under my jacket right away. I looked at the trunk, thinking about the shotgun buried under the cooler and the heavy bags, but unpacking all that gear out here in the open felt like ringing a dinner bell. We left it. Speed mattered more than noise right now. The cabin padlock was hanging open on the hasp, not broken, just unlocked. That meant either I had left it that way, which I hadn't, or someone had opened it and didn't have the discipline to lock it again. Calla touched my arm and said, "We go inside first, clear it." I nodded and held up a hand for her to stay half a step behind me. The cabin door opened with the same sticky drag as always. Inside, the air smelled like pine needles and old stove ash. Nothing looked trashed, but a chair was angled differently and a utensil drawer sat half open. Little signs that someone had moved through here recently. Calla noticed the counter and said, "Someone ate here." A single paper plate sat in the sink with a crust of something dried on it, and an empty water bottle sat beside it. We didn't have time to make it a mystery. The first job was to see if the shore was clean enough to use for 10 minutes. Calla lifted the curtain a finger's width and said, "There are mud tracks by the dock." I stepped onto the porch and scanned the neighbor cabins spaced along the shore. A porch light was on down the bank where it shouldn't have been, burning pale in the daylight, and a figure drifted past a window, slow and off balance. Farther down, a shout turned into a thin scream and then stopped abruptly. We backed into the cabin and shut the door. I said, "We take what we need and we do it fast." And Calla answered, "Tell me what to grab." The list was simple. Tools, screws, duct tape, the handsaw, gloves, and anything soft that could block drafts later. She pulled spare wool blankets off the bed and stuffed them into a tote. I grabbed the heavy toolbox, a coil of rope, and the box of Strike Anywhere matches. At the back wall, a stack of rough boards leaned under the window, leftovers from when I patched the porch decking. I tested one solid and dry, and Calla said, "Those will cover a window if we have to barricade." I nodded and slid 4 boards onto my shoulder. We stepped out again and kept low, moving between the trees toward the water. The houseboat rocked gently and the line looked tight, but the knot was definitely not mine. It was a sloppy hitch, tied fast. Calla stood close and said, "If someone is on it, we can't get trapped out on that dock." I watched the dark windows and said, "Then we don't go out there unless we can get off in one step. We clear it from the boards." A ripple moved through the dead reeds to our left. Something shifted in the cattails and then went still. It might have been a bird. It might have been a person. Either way, standing on the open dock with an armful of lumber was the wrong place to decide. Across the cove, something thumped on a neighbor's dock, wood on wood, then a slow drag like feet that didn't lift. Calla's hand found my sleeve and stayed there, gripping hard. I said, "We do this like we're stealing our own boat." And she answered, "Slow hands, no noise, and we leave if it's bad." I set the boards down on the planks, kept my eyes on the shore, and said, "We wait for a clean moment, then we go, and once we're on, we push off immediately." Calla swallowed, nodded once, and whispered, "Okay." Out on the lake, the water looked flat and empty. On the shore, it already felt crowded. That was the problem we had to solve before night fully dropped. The lake should have felt empty in late fall, just gray water and silence, but it didn't. It felt watched. The shoreline cabins sat dark and still, but the prickly sensation on the back of my neck said we weren't alone. From behind the tree line, I could see my houseboat at the end of the dock, boxy and low in the water, and the dock itself looked less like a path to safety and more like a narrow wooden bridge to a bad decision. Calla stood close enough that our shoulders almost touched, her breathing shallow. She kept her voice low and said, "That's Drew's place down the bank, right?" I nodded without looking away, mostly because Drew's cabin door was hanging wide open, and it definitely hadn't been open an hour earlier when we arrived. A shape drifted through the doorway and stepped out onto the porch, and the second I saw the slack jaw and the loose, heavy drop of the shoulders, I knew it wasn't a neighbor coming out to check on a noise. "That's him," Calla added, and her fingers tightened painfully on the sleeve of my jacket. Drew didn't scan the cabins or call for help. He looked straight at the dock and started walking toward it with that stiff, hungry gait, hands half raised like a sleepwalker trying to find a light switch. A second infected figure followed him down from farther along the shore, a woman I didn't recognize, and when she hit the shallow edge of the lake, she stepped straight into the water without pausing. The silt along that bank is 3 feet deep and acts like quicksand. It grabbed her boots, then her shins, and she kept reaching forward anyway, oblivious to the physics holding her back. Calla watched her sink to her knees and said, "They don't understand the mud, and they don't stop breathing." The dock was the real danger. It was a choke point. To reach the boat, we had to cross 50 feet of open wood, and once we were out there, the only exits were forward into the cabin, back through Drew, or into freezing water. I slid the strap of the tote higher on my shoulder and checked our hands. No loose metal, no clanking gear, nothing to give us away. Calla glanced at the end of the dock and whispered, "We do not get trapped halfway out there." And I answered, "We move when he turns his head, we don't run, and we absolutely do not stop." We waited for a clean moment. Drew reached the first plank and paused, his head tilting to the side as if he could hear the blood in our veins, and I held perfectly still until his attention slid toward the splashing woman in the mud. "Now," Calla said, the word barely louder than the wind, and we stepped out together. Docks always creak no matter how well you build them. We kept our weight centered and our steps short, rolling heel to toe to dampen the impact. But we still got a low, dry groan from the boards. Drew's head snapped back instantly. His mouth opened and a thin, wet sound came out, not a word, just a harsh expulsion of breath that carried over the water like a hiss. Calla sped up in that controlled, tight way you use on black ice, and she said, "Keep moving. Don't look at him." And I focused on the houseboat door like it was the only thing in the world that mattered. My hands were shaking just enough to make the key feel like it didn't fit, but I forced it into the lock. Drew's shoes thudded on the dock behind us. the rhythm heavy and uneven, close enough that the sound of him was vibrating inside my ribs. Calla stayed to my left with the boat hook angled down like a pike, and she said, "Open it, bags in, then lines. Go." I got the lock open on the second twist. The door swung inward, revealing an empty, dark cabin. I shoved the first tote across the threshold, then the heavy toolbox, then the water jug, and Calla slipped inside behind them to drop her pack. She reached back, grabbed the handle, and pulled the door most of the way closed without clicking the latch, then looked at me through the gap and said, "Bowline first. Get us loose." I dropped into a crouch, worked the hitch, which was definitely not one of mine, with cold fingers, and pulled the stiff rope free in one clean motion, coiling it on the deck so it wouldn't snag a foot. Drew reached the last stretch of dock and sped up in a sudden, jerky lunge like his body had just remembered how to run. The stern line was still tight, pinning us to the wood. Calla moved to it, shoulders hunched, head down, and she said, "Oh, give me 2 seconds." I raised my voice just enough to carry over the wind. "Hey!" I shouted, not because it would calm him, but because sound pulls focus. Drew jerked toward my voice, eyes wide and milky, and that half-second of distraction gave Calla room to work the knot. The stern line came free and the houseboat drifted an inch from the dock. The gap opened to a foot, then 2. Drew lunged again, fingers scraping at the air, and his front foot found nothing but the gap. He went down hard on his knees, chest slamming the dock, and reached for the rail with both hands. I set the blunt end of the boat hook against the dock post and pushed with everything I had. The hull eased away in a slow, heavy glide, and Drew's hands grabbed empty space, his fingernails scratching the paint as we drifted out of reach. Behind him, the woman in the shallows kept pawing at the wet boards of the shoreline, trying to pull herself out of the suction. Her hands slid uselessly off the wood. The sound of the struggle was small, but it drew another figure from the trees, then another. Shapes wobbling down the slope toward the water. Calla stepped inside, pulled the door shut, and threw the deadbolt with a hard, final click. She leaned her back against the metal for one long, shaky breath, then said, "Okay, we're off." We let the lake do the work at first. No engine, no noise, just drift. The houseboat caught the light breeze and slid out past the cattails, and the dock shrank into a dark strip of wood with infected shapes pacing at its end. Drew stood there, swaying back and forth like he was trying to solve a problem he couldn't name. Calla moved to the nearest window, cracked the blind just enough to see without throwing a bright rectangle at the shore, and she said, "We need to get out of sight, somewhere those cabins can't watch us." I scanned the cove. A point of pines pushed out into the water to our right, and behind it the shoreline bent into a quieter pocket with thick reeds and a low, muddy bank. "There," I said, and used the boat hook in short, silent pushes to keep the bow from swinging back. As we eased away, a shout carried from farther down the shoreline, then another, and then a scream that stopped way too fast. Calla didn't turn toward it. She just looked at the dark water and said, "That's not us anymore," and I understood what she meant. The shore was turning into a place where every sound invited company. The open water felt safer than land, but it also felt exposed. A small square boat on a gray lake is a sitting duck if someone is looking for targets. We weren't home anymore. We were floating. That was better than being trapped on a dock, but it was still only the start because the next problems were already lined up. Heat, water, food, and the fact that people with boats could follow us. And once night dropped, the lake would hide us from the dead, but it wouldn't hide us from the living. We let the wind and the slow, heavy pull of the lake carry us behind the point. And the moment the shoreline cabins dropped out of view, my shoulders finally loosened, because being unseen felt like the first real advantage we had earned all day. The pocket wasn't anything special to look at, just a muddy notch in the reeds with a low bank and a few dead branches breaking up the outline. But it gave us room to think without a scope on us. The houseboat drifted until the hull brushed the cattails with a soft, dry scrape. Then the anchor went out, the rope paying out slowly until the flukes bit into the mud, and I double-checked the swing radius to make sure we wouldn't drift back into open water when the breeze shifted. Inside, the cabin held that specific damp cold that lives in thin walls and unheated floors. Calla rubbed her hands together, looked at the cold iron of the stove and said, "Heat first, then we do everything else. If we get hypothermic, the rest doesn't matter." The wood stove sat where I'd bolted it years ago, a compact black box with a simple pipe through the roof, and a plastic bin under the bench held kindling, matches, and a few split sticks left over from the last trip. She slid the bin closer and added, "Small fire, steady draft, and if we hear a motor, we kill the light and damper it down immediately." The first burn stayed modest. Dry slats, one match, door cracked to feed oxygen, then a slow close once the flame caught. The metal ticked and pinged as it warmed, and I watched the seams and the pipe collar for any smoke leak while Calla cracked a window a finger width, because carbon monoxide is a quiet killer and comfort doesn't matter if you wake up dead. A battery lantern went on the table with a warm yellow glow, kept low enough to work but not bright enough to advertise our position. And the room finally stopped feeling like a refrigerated box. Water came next. The lake looked clean in the way cold water can fool you, so we treated it like it was toxic from the start. A pot went on the stovetop and Calla poured in bottled water first to save fuel, then set the hiking filter beside it and said, "Boiling is the rule. The filter is backup. We don't take chances with dysentery." The boil took time, but wood was cheaper than sickness and the stove heat did double work. Food stayed plain on purpose. We ate nuts, a protein bar each, and a couple of bites of cheese because cooking anything greasy like bacon or fish would push a scent trail across the water and make us easy to find. Once the stove settled into a steady hum, we organized what we had, not just to be neat but to avoid fumbling in the dark later. We triaged the gear. One tote became food only, sealed tight. One tote became medical and hygiene. Soap, wipes, trash bags, and a spray bottle went by the sink, and Calla tapped the lid and said, "Hands before food every time, even if it's freezing, we don't cross-contaminate." A bucket under the counter became the dirty bucket for rinsing and food scraps, and a second bucket stayed clean for boiled water, because mixing those up is exactly how people get sick in a camp. The bathroom got a simple hygiene corner setup, a clean towel stack in a sealed Ziploc bag, and a trash can lined and tied off. Then the silence in the room changed. We both looked at the space where a weapon should have been. The shotgun was still in the sedan back at the cabin, buried under the cooler. Calla saw my face shift and asked, "We made the call for speed, but now we're under-equipped, right?" I nodded and told her, "The shotgun is still wedged in the trunk. Leaving it bought us time on the dock, but I don't like sitting here without it." She held still for a second, weighing the risk, then said, "Not tonight, and not alone. We plan a retrieval when the shore is quiet." Bear spray came off her pack and went on the shelf by the door where it could be grabbed in one fluid motion, and she added, "This buys distance without punching holes in our own walls." The heavy boat hook leaned beside it, and a tactical flashlight sat within reach. Sleep came in jagged pieces. Blankets went over the biggest windows, not as a ritual, but as insulation and blackout curtains. And one narrow gap stayed open so we could watch the waterline without throwing a bright rectangle outside. Calla tested the door lock twice, sat on the edge of the bed and said, "One of us stays up for a while. I can't sleep yet anyway." I answered, "I'll take first watch, you get your hours." And she lay down without argument. Reeds brushed the hull now and then. The stove ticked as it held heat, and the anchor line creaked once when the wind shifted. Morning arrived gray and sharp. Coals still glowed deep in the stove, and that felt like winning a small bet against the cold. Calla poured boiled water into a mug and said, "We start a routine now, or we burn ourselves out." And she was right, because panic is expensive on calories. Fishing was the first real long-term lever we had. The gear wasn't fancy, 2 rods, a small tackle box, and spare line in a locker, but the lake had always been generous if you were patient. A simple line went over the side and tied off to a cleat, baited with lunch meat scraps, and I wrapped a strip of rubber around the line where it touched the metal so it wouldn't tap against the cleat and ring like a bell. Late morning, the line tugged, steady and alive. A catfish rolled up and slapped the surface, and Calla smiled for half a second before she caught herself and said, "Okay, that helps. Keep it quiet." A thick towel went down on the deck to mute the noise. I pulled the fish up onto it, and the work stayed quick and silent because a struggling fish banging on a metal deck carries sound for miles. It wasn't a feast, but it was proof of concept. Heat you can feed, water you can trust, food you can replace, and rules you can repeat without thinking. By afternoon, the houseboat felt less like a weekend toy and more like a hardened shelter that could hold us through a cold night, and that made one thought louder than the rest. If we were surviving this well, someone else would notice eventually. A thin gray fog sat heavy on the lake that afternoon, not quite thick enough to hide a boat completely, but just enough to throw off your depth perception and make every engine sound feel like it was right on top of you. Calla was slicing the catfish into thin strips for a covered pot when the faint, throaty note of an outboard rolled in from beyond the rocky point. The sound held steady, then faded, then returned, like someone was idling down, listening and circling. Calla set the knife down, wiped her hands on a rag and said, "That's a motor and it's not passing through." The lantern gave the cabin a warm yellow glow, and she added, "If it gets any closer, we kill the light and we don't move a muscle." A few minutes later, a shape slid through the fog near the reed line, moving on paddles, not a motor. It was a small, battered aluminum john boat, riding dangerously low in the water, with two people bundled in heavy coats. They didn't wave or call out. They were hugging the shallow bank, aiming to pass our pocket by 20 yards, like pretending we weren't there could keep them safe. I slid the side window open just enough for my voice to carry over the water and said, "Hold right there. Don't come any closer and keep your hands where I can see them." The man in the stern froze, rested his paddle across his knees with his hands open and answered, "Okay, we're stopped. We're not looking for trouble." The woman in the bow stared at our window with intense, tired eyes and said, "We're not trying to board you. We want to trade. We're in a bad spot." The man reached slowly into his jacket, pulled out the yellow cap of a diesel can and held it up between two fingers like a peace offering. "We've got 5 gallons of diesel," he said, his voice rough from cold, "and a fresh deep-cycle marine battery. We'll trade it all for one warm night and a place to dry out." Calla leaned close to my shoulder and whispered, "That's not a random offer, that's desperate." I kept my eyes on the fog beyond them and said, "Names first." The man answered, "Kellen Drum." He tipped his chin toward the bow and said, "Nomi Sutter. We were at the Marina when it went bad and we left because the shore turned ugly fast." Before I could ask anything else, the outboard note returned, louder now, holding a steady, aggressive spot behind the fog like a shadow. Kellen's eyes flicked toward the sound and he said, "That's why we're here." Nomi leaned forward, gripping the gunwale, and added, "A boat has been tailing us since we left the inlet. It's a center console, faster than us, but we've been sticking to the shallow weed lines where their prop would foul if they tried to follow." Calla kept her voice low and asked, "How close are they?" Kellen answered, "Close enough to close the gap the second we drift into open water." Nomi added, "They're playing the waiting game. They know we have to come out eventually or freeze, and they're just waiting for us to make a mistake." The fog thinned for a second and a longer boat showed itself at the edge of visibility. An outboard idling, 2 figures sitting upright and relaxed. It wasn't a rescue posture, it was a predator posture. Calla said, "If they see us talking, they'll figure out we have supplies." Kellen nodded once and said, "We didn't want to drag trouble to your doorstep, but we can't outrun them and we can't stay out here tonight." Nomi looked straight at the window and said, "We can make this worth it. We can help you hold this boat, but we can't do it from a canoe." Calla touched my forearm and said, "Fast, do it." I grabbed the boat hook and stepped to the door. "Bag first," I said. "Then you, one at a time, and hands stay visible the whole time." Kellen eased his bow around with one quiet, skilled paddle stroke and tossed a waterproof dry bag onto our deck. It landed with a dull, heavy thump and didn't bounce, which told me it was packed solid. I nudged it back with the hook so my feet weren't near it, and Calla pulled it inside without opening it. Through the fog, the raider boat drifted closer by a few yards, the engine still low, testing the perimeter. Kellen climbed aboard first, moving slow, palms open, stepping up like he expected to see a gun barrel. Calla pointed toward the sink and said, "Hands and forearms, use the soap, then wait by the table. Don't touch anything else." He nodded and did it without argument. Nomi followed with a smaller bag, and before Calla could repeat herself, Nomi said, "I know the drill." She scrubbed hard, then rolled her sleeves up to show clean skin, and that simple gesture did more than any long explanation could have. Calla kept the questions simple, asked them to show wrists and necks, checked for fresh bandages or bites, then said, "No one touches food or water until you wash again, understood?" They both nodded. Calla cracked the blind and said, "They're still out there." The raider boat slid across the open water, not leaving, just shifting its angle to get a better look at the new variable, us. Kellen dried his hands and said, "We can leave if you want, but they'll follow us and then they'll come back here anyway because now they know where you are." Nomi reached into her bag, pulled out a heavy jingling keyring and set it on the table. Metal tags hung from it, stamped and scratched from use. She tapped one with her fingernail and said, "These are the Marina service keys Master said, not house keys." She lifted the tags and read them off. Fuel dock, main office, maintenance shed. Calla's eyebrows rose and she asked, "Where did you get those?" Nomi answered without dressing it up. "Parking lot by the ramp. A guy in a Marina jacket was down on the gravel, bleeding out, and nobody was helping him. I took what I could before someone else did." The stove ticked softly as it held heat, and the room went quiet because that keyring changed the entire plan. A shed key meant tarps, heavy rope, hardware, and maybe a spare prop, and it also explained why a boat would tail a couple this hard through the reeds. They didn't just want a canoe, they wanted the keys to the kingdom. Outside, the raider boat slid closer again, still not calling out, still watching. Calla's hand went to the lantern switch and she waited for my look. "Now," I said, and the warm light died, leaving only the stove's dull red glow. Kellen swallowed and said, "They started friendly a few miles back, asking if we needed help, then asking what we had in the bags. When we didn't come alongside, they stopped smiling." Nomi added, "They don't want to trade. They want a base and they want people who can keep it running." The fog thickened again, and the raider boat became a darker smear on the water, still there, still listening. The four of us stood in the heat of the stove, and it was clear the lake had a new rule. Once someone finds you, they don't forget. And if they were patient enough to wait in the fog for a canoe, they would be patient enough to come back for a houseboat with a plan. The fog thinned out overnight and left the lake looking flat and hard. The kind of brutal cold morning where sound carries for miles and your fingers go numb just holding a coffee mug. Nobody explicitly talked about the boat that had watched us in the mist, but everyone was listening for it, and that tense silence told me the next moves had to be fast, clean, and deliberate. Kellen warmed his hands near the stove vent and said, "If you want boards and marine-grade rope, you need to hit that Marina shed before other people figure out what these keys open." Nomi nodded, looking at the map on her phone, and added, "The shed will be picked over the second word spreads that the staff is gone. It's a race." Calla kept her voice level and said, "We're not walking the docks blind. We scan, we grab, we go." Then she looked at me and waited, because ultimately it was still our boat and our risk. A plan came together in simple steps. Daylight operation only, one landing, one specific purpose, and back on the water before the shore had time to notice us. The warm yellow lantern stayed off. We used the gray daylight filtering through the blinds, and we packed our gear like we were leaving in a hurry. Bags zipped tight, tools secured on straps, and nothing loose to clank against the hull. Before anyone stepped outside, the hygiene corner got real. Calla cleared a patch of counter space by the sink, laid out soap, wipes, and a spray bottle of bleach solution and said, "Dirty hands do not touch food. Ever." Nomi added a strip of duct tape on the counter to physically mark the clean side from the dirty side, then set a trash bag in a bucket and folded the top tight so it would seal in any smell. It was basic, almost childish, but it meant we could come back wet, cold and covered in filth, and still keep the boat from turning into a sickness box. We eased the houseboat closer to the marina with the absolute smallest amount of noise, running the throttle low, then drifting in neutral. Then a short push again to correct the angle. Kellen and I went ashore while Calla and Nomi stayed on the boat, watching through a narrow gap in the curtains and keeping the engine warm. The moment my boots hit the dock boards, the old instinct to hurry kicked in, but hurrying makes noise, so we moved steady instead, stepping where the boards looked solid and avoiding the loose cleats that rattled. The shed key fit the heavy padlock on the maintenance building without a fight. The lock clicked, and Kellen whispered, "Good," like he didn't want the lake to hear it. Inside, the shed smelled like diesel fuel and wet wood. It was a gold mine. Tarps were stacked on a shelf, heavy canvas and blue plastic, dirty but intact. A coil of real braided dock rope hung on a peg, the kind that doesn't snap in a storm. A plastic crate held screws, washers, and steel brackets. Kellen grabbed the heavy coil and said, "This is the kind of line you can trust your life with." And I took the armload of tarps because tarps solve more problems than almost anything else out here. A spare brass prop sat in a box near the back wall, still wrapped in greasy plastic. There was no celebration, just the grim satisfaction of securing insurance, because a damaged prop ends a boat and a spare keeps it alive. We added a small tool bag, a cordless drill with a bit set, and a roll of foam wrap meant for insulating pipes. Before leaving, Kellen pointed at a rack of orange life jackets and said, "Take them. All of them." And we did, because cold water turns panic into drowning in about 3 minutes. On the way out, voices floated across the water, distant and sharp. Somebody was shouting at the boat ramp, and another voice answered angrily. Kellen's head snapped toward the sound, and he said, "We're done here. Move." We didn't run. We moved with purpose, loaded the gear, and pushed off. Back on the houseboat, Calla took one look at the hull and said, "Straight back to our pocket, don't stop." The engine turned over, the Marina slid away into the distance, and nobody followed us, which felt like luck we didn't deserve. Fortifying started the second the anchor set in the mud. The biggest windows were the tactical weakness. Boards from the cabin went up first, not pretty carpentry, just drywall screws driving wood into frame so a hand couldn't pop the glass and reach the lock. Tarps went over that, tied to the rails, and waited at the bottom, breaking up the square shape of the boat and adding a layer against the biting wind. Nomi handled the inside like a place that had to last for months. She picked a corner away from the stove for dry goods, set food crates off the floor to keep them dry, and labeled every container with dates, because guessing later wastes supplies. She found damp spots on the walls by touch, then said, "Condensation is the quiet enemy," and she laid towels and scrap foam where the cold aluminum met the warm air. Kellen worked outside with quiet, capable hands. He used the new rope to add a second anchor line for stability, then rigged a short line along the side rail so a grappling hook would slide off instead of biting into the metal. Calla watched him work and asked, "Will that really stop someone from boarding?" Kellen answered, "No. But it makes them work for it, and working makes noise." That was the point. Not a perfect defense, just enough friction to wake us up before they got in. House rules went up in plain language because confusion gets people hurt. Calla spoke them out loud while Nomi wrote them on a piece of cardboard taped by the door. Hands washed on entry always. No one goes on deck alone after dark. The stove stays small and the smoke stays thin. If a motor comes close, lights go off and nobody stands in a window. If someone wants to come alongside, they stop at distance and we talk through a crack. The last job was the shotgun. It was still in the sedan behind the cabin, and leaving it there felt like leaving a limb behind. We waited for midday when the high sun made the shore shadows easier to read, then took the boat back to our cabin dock for a surgical grab. The shore still looked bad. 2 infected figures wandered near a neighbor's porch, turning in slow, confused circles like they were stuck on a scent. Calla stayed at the boat door with the bear spray, and Nomi watched the bank with binoculars while Kellen and I moved up the slope straight to the car. The shotgun case came out of the trunk, along with a heavy box of shells, and a small hatchet I had forgotten was buried in the wheel well. We were back on the dock before the infected even looked our way. By the time the boat slid back into the reeds, the houseboat felt different. It looked rougher from the outside, like a floating pile of junk, but it worked better on the inside, warmer, drier, and organized. That should have felt like safety, but it also meant we had something worth stealing. When you build something that works, you have to be ready to defend it. Routine held us together for a while, acting like glue until it didn't, because the lake didn't care that we were organized. It just kept getting colder and the water kept getting busier. Morning started with the exact same safety check every single time, without exception. The stove got fed dry, split wood first so the draft stayed clean and smokeless. The pot went on for the daily water boil, and the window covering stayed strictly in place until the sky was bright enough to work without the lantern. Calla treated the houseboat like a home and a tactical shelter at the same time, moving quietly in wool socks, keeping the warm yellow light low and shielded, and saying, "If we can do this without anyone noticing we're even awake, we do it that way." Kellen made firewood and noise control his personal job. Splitting kindling happened outside on a thick folded towel so the metal deck didn't ring like a dinner bell with every hatchet strike. Then he stacked the day's wood under a tarp weighted down with a heavy toolbox so the wind couldn't flip it and create a visual flag. Nomi kept the inside dry and predictable. She wiped moisture off the sweating metal frames, set towels where condensation dripped, and taped simple masking tape labels on every bin, because grabbing the wrong bag in the dark is how you spill food or waste time you don't have. Fishing became the steady food source, not a hobby to pass the time. Lines went out close to the reeds, kept low so they couldn't be spotted from the open lake, and they got pulled at different times of the day so nobody watching from the shore could learn our pattern. Calla watched me tie on a hook one afternoon and said, "The second this looks like a settled camp, someone will treat it like a supply stop." I answered, "Then we never look settled, we just look parked." And Kellen added, "And we never leave our gear hanging out like bait." The first real cold snap hit that week and made every small mistake expensive. The wind shoved the houseboat hard against the reed mat. The anchor rope groaned under the tension, and the aluminum hull made short, rhythmic rubbing sounds against the cattails that kept everyone half awake. Nomi listened to it for a minute in the dark, then said, "That rubbing sound will travel underwater." Kellen went out immediately with a headlamp cupped deep in his palm to hide the beam, adjusted the line tension, and wrapped a rag around the cleat so the rope couldn't squeal. He came back in with red cheeks and stiff fingers and said, "It's quiet now, but if we get ice, we have to reset and move deep or the hull will crush." Power stayed limited, and that forced a strict discipline. The battery bank ran the radio and a few essential lights, but nobody wanted a bright cabin glowing on a dark lake. Nomi went around the room finding every tiny source of light: the charger glow, the little green dot on the water pump switch, the radio display, and she taped over them with black tape until the cabin stayed dark from the outside even when things were running. Calla watched her work and said, "You did this for museum storage back in the city?" Nomi nodded and answered, "Same idea, different stakes. Keep the environment stable and don't invite trouble." The hygiene corner mattered more as the days stacked up and we lived on top of each other. A clean side and a dirty side stayed marked at the sink with tape, hands and forearms got washed after any deck work, and a spray bottle of bleach solution lived by the door for quick wipe-downs. Calla kept it simple and said, "Nobody eats with lake hands." And the rule held because nobody wanted to be the one who brought dysentery or flu into a small room with no exit. Small problems kept testing us. One morning, the stove smoked back into the cabin for a few seconds when a sudden gust pushed down the pipe. Kellen opened the air gap, let the fire drop to coals, and said, "We burn small and heavy wind from now on." Nomi wrote it on the rule card by the door, and Calla nodded once like she was adding it to a permanent list in her head. Then the lake gave us a warning that wasn't weather. An engine note carried across the water in the mid-afternoon, slow and steady, and a small boat appeared past the rocky point, far enough away that the faces were just pale shapes. It didn't charge in. It drifted and turned in wide arcs, like the driver was scanning the shoreline for smoke, tarps, or anything that looked lived in. Calla reached for the lantern switch without even looking at it and said, "Light off." And the cabin went dim while all four of us crowded the wall to watch through a narrow gap in the blinds. Kellen stayed low and said, "That's not fishing." Nomi kept her eyes on the boat and answered, "It's checking. That's recon." And I could hear the calm in her voice, the way she spoke when she was already sorting through bad options. The boat idled for a slow minute, the occupants looking right at our patch of reeds, then eased away, and nobody waved, nobody called out, and that silence made it worse than a shout. The rest of that day we changed our habits on purpose. Fishing lines went out at random times. The stove ran hotter for a short stretch to boil water, then low for an hour to kill the smoke, and meals stayed covered pots instead of anything that would throw a smell. The lantern moved to a back corner on the floor and only came on when the blinds were totally blacked out. It wasn't paranoia. It was learning. That evening, a big catfish hit our line and slapped the water hard on the way up. Kellen flinched and said, "That sound carries," and Calla threw a towel down and pulled the fish onto it so the deck wouldn't ring. Nomi watched the window gap and said, "Quiet work is not polite anymore, it's survival," and the fish went into a covered pot with rice. No frying, no smoke, no reason for anyone to remember the scent of cooking fat. Night brought more signs that we weren't alone. A faint light moved on the far shore, blinking like a signal. Another motor passed in the distance, running without lights. Once, two sharp pops echoed across the lake, gunshots, close enough to make everyone freeze, followed by silence. Calla sat at the table with her hands around a mug and said, "They're going to start taking boats." Kellen answered, "Then we make ours hard to take." The radio didn't offer help, only repetition. Avoid contact. Service is overwhelmed. Stay inside. Nomi turned the volume down and said, "That means we're on our own." Calla answered, "Then we act like it every day." By the time the stove burned down for the night, the houseboat felt warmer and safer than any shore. But it also felt like a prize, and prizes attract people who don't ask for permission. The first real push came on a deceptively clear morning when every sound carried across the water like it was amplified. We had just pulled the lines and brought in 2 decent fish, and the stove was running low and clean when Calla tilted her head, froze, and said, "That's not the wind." An outboard note had started up beyond the rocky point, steady, patient, and getting louder. Kellen slid the shotgun case onto the table, unzipped it with careful hands, and checked the chamber. I kept my voice low and said, "Nobody stands in a window and nobody lets a hull touch our rail." Calla nodded once, grabbed the bear spray, and added, "If they come close, the light goes off and we talk through the door crack." 2 flat-bottomed John boats appeared around the bend, both riding low with men and gear. They didn't act lost or curious. They aimed straight at our reed pocket like they already knew exactly where it was. The lead boat cut its engine and drifted in, stopping just short of easy boarding distance. A man stood in the bow with his hands spread wide like he was trying to calm a bar fight. I slid the side window open just enough for the barrel of the shotgun to remain hidden but accessible and said, "Stay right there and keep your hands visible." He smiled like he'd practiced it in a mirror and answered, "Morning. We're just here for a talk, neighbor." His eyes moved greedily over our tarps, the reinforced windows, and the solar setup, and he added, "You've got heat, food, and a solid platform. That's valuable out here," Calla whispered from behind the door. "He's not here to trade. He's shopping." The man kept going, smooth and confident. "We're building a base out on the main island," he said, "and we're taking in people with skills who can help." I asked, "What do you want?" The smile thinned out and he answered, "We want you with us. You contribute your gear, you follow our rules, and you stop hiding in the weeds." Kellen stayed low behind me and said, "That sounds a lot like you taking our boat." The man shrugged. "Call it what you want," he said, "but winter is here and people are done starving." He tipped his head toward his partner in the stern, and I saw the guy lift a heavy coil of grappling rope. Calla saw it too and said, "They're going to hook the rail." I raised my voice hard and flat. "Back out," I said, "right now." The man's tone turned cold. "Dexter," he said, using my name like a tool to pry me open. "We can do this clean or we can do it ugly, but we are doing it." Then he pointed toward our door and added, "Come out, hands empty." Nomi stepped close behind me and whispered, "They know your name because someone watched us at the cabin or someone talked." She glanced at the Marina keys on our table and added, "If they take the boat, they take everything and we end up in the water." Calla set the bear spray on the counter where her hand could find it blind and said, "If metal touches our rail, we answer fast." The second John boat widened its arc to flank our stern. The lead boat eased forward on idle, slow enough to look friendly, close enough to be a terminal threat. The grappling hook came up, clinked against our rail, and started to bite into the aluminum. Kellen cracked the door and shoved the heavy end of the boat hook out hard, knocking the grapple loose before it could set. The bowman cursed and grabbed for the rail with his hand, and Calla leaned into the gap and fired the bear spray in a short, violent burst. The orange mist hit his face instantly. He recoiled, coughing and swearing, blinding the front sector. The lead man stopped smiling. He barked, "Get on them!" And the second boat surged in, engine roaring. A handgun came up on their side, and a round snapped past the window frame and slapped the water behind us. That ended the pretending. I brought the shotgun up, aimed low, and didn't hesitate. I fired once, not at the boat, but at the man holding the rope. He dropped backward into the hull without a sound. The boat rocked violently. The other men yelled and ducked behind the gunnels. Kellen stepped beside me with the hatchet ready and said, "They're trying to flank." Calla moved to the stern slit, watched the second boat, and said, "They're pushing to pin us against the bank." Nomi shoved the service keys into her pocket and yelled, "If we're moving, we move now!" The reeds boxed us in on one side, and their boats were trying to sit on our corners to lock us in. The engine started with a roar. The houseboat lurched, slow but heavy, and the bow began to press through the thick reeds, seeking open water. The driver of the second boat stood up to fire again. I pumped the shotgun, swung the barrel, and fired. The shot took him in the chest. He went over the side, and the tiller arm snapped back, sending the boat into a tight, uncontrolled spin. The remaining men scrambled, panic replacing their plan as their driver disappeared. The lead boat was drifting sideways, its commander down. Nomi kept her eyes on the open water and said, "Keep us moving, punch through." The houseboat pushed out of the reed pocket into deeper water, tearing through the vegetation. Their boats were lighter and faster, but the command structure was gone and they were too busy trying to pull their dead from the water to chase a target that bites back. We didn't stop to assess the damage. The second boat was spinning in circles, engine whining, and the lead boat was dead in the water. Silence hit hard after the noise, broken only by our own engine and the slap of water against the hull. Calla stood at the table with her hands shaking, adrenaline dumping into her system, and said, "We can't stay here." Nomi swallowed hard and answered, "They came for a base and for people. Others will come looking when they don't come back." Kellen watched the fog line, his face grim, and added, "We move before the rest of them come to see what happened to their friends." The anchor came up fast and wet. We didn't look back at the bodies or the drifting boats. The houseboat ran low along the far shore and eased into a narrow, choked inlet where dead trees leaned over the water and reeds closed behind us like a curtain. Back inside, Nomi wiped the door handle and the counter without being asked, scrubbing away the feeling of the encounter. Kellen counted the remaining shells, then said, "No more warnings," and nobody disagreed, not after today. Once we were hidden again, the stove stayed off and the lantern stayed dark. We sat in our coats and listened to the wind, and Calla finally said, her voice flat and cold, "They weren't going to leave us alive, Dexter." I looked at the shotgun on the table and answered, "I know. That's why they aren't." We stayed pinned in that choked-up inlet for 2 full nights, not because it was comfortable, but because it broke the sight line from the open lake and forced us to slow down. The houseboat sat wedged under leaning trees and dead reeds that brushed the roof with a dry hiss whenever the wind shifted. The stove stayed cold that first day. A cold camp, Kellen called it. And we ate straight from the cans without cooking, because even a thin plume of smoke against a gray sky can pull eyes your way. Calla kept the yellow lantern wrapped in a thick towel and only used it in short bursts with the blinds fully covered. She said, "Light is a luxury we can only afford when we control the angles. Right now, it just puts a target on our backs." Kellen took over the practical jobs without a speech. He checked the anchor line for fraying, kept all deck work silent, and staged tools where they could be grabbed in a heartbeat. Nomi kept the inside from devolving into chaos. She wiped surfaces, aggressively protected the clean and dirty zones, and kept the sink area prepped. Because after a scare, people tend to get lazy with hygiene, and that's when you pay for it. The hardest part was the silence after the shooting. Nobody bragged about the aim. Nobody played tough. Calla sat with her hands wrapped around a mug of cold water and said, "I keep replaying his voice in my head." I answered, "The same here," and then I said the plain, ugly truth. They were not coming to talk, Calla. They were coming to own us. By the 3rd morning, the lake looked the same as it always had, gray water, skeleton branches, and a cold sun. But our rules had fundamentally changed. First, we established a hard perimeter. No boat gets close enough to touch our rail. If someone wants to speak, they stop at distance and we keep the door shut. Second, we stop living in one spot. A fixed pocket feels safe until it gets mapped. So now we rotate between 3 hiding places and never stay long enough to build a pattern. Food stays steady because routine keeps you sane. Fishing lines go out at odd random times. We clean fish on towels to dampen the sound and bag the waste tight, sinking it in deep water so the smell doesn't cling to our corner. The stove runs in short. Controlled burns using only dry wood, and a pot of water always sits on top so we have a hydration reserve. Power stays minimal. The radio stays low. Batteries get topped off only when the sky allows, and if a charger light leaks, Nomi covers it with tape without a comment. Hygiene is strict law now. Hands wash on entry every single time. 1 towel for clean hands, 1 for dirty jobs, and Calla makes sure nobody forgets. The biggest lesson is simple. Water buys you time, but it does not erase people. It keeps the infected on the bank, sure, but it also funnels the living into boats and docks and narrow lanes where everyone watches everyone else. If you have heat, if you have food, if you have a steady routine, someone will decide you should share it, and some people only know one kind of sharing. Right now, we're still afloat. The houseboat is patched, warm enough to function, and quiet enough to disappear when we need to. Calla is tougher than she ever wanted to be. Kellen and Nomi earned their space here, and the boat works better because they're on it. We don't talk about the men who tried to take it. We just act like they left a ripple that can come back at any moment. If you're hearing this, keep it simple. Get distance early. Keep your heat source something you can feed without the grid. Treat water like it's poison until you've boiled it. Build a hygiene corner even if it feels silly. And don't let strangers close enough to turn a conversation into a grab. We'll keep moving, we'll keep fishing, and we'll keep the lights low. If there's a safe place on the water, it isn't a spot on a map. It's a set of habits you can repeat in the dark. If you enjoyed the story, please like, subscribe, and comment where you're listening from. See you in the next one.